we're going to move to our final segment, which is about the movies. Allow me to say just one thing before I introduce Martin Winkler. Cinema and Ovid. There's an episode which is recounted by Martin himself in his monograph. It's about the Italian poet D'Annunzio, who is, a powerful voice of Italian literature at the beginning of the 20th century. He was very keen on innovation and modernity. So in 1910, he's walking around the city of Turin, which was the starting point of the Italian movie industry, the closest Italian city to France. And he was musing about this latest news about the new art of cinema. And he was thinking, no, it looks shallow to me. It's superficial. There's no way I will get involved in the movies. And then he keeps walking, and then he thinks, well, wait a second. What if there is a film about Apollo and Daphne? Now, I want to do that. That's something I want to do that. And so he gets involved in the cinema production. So that's why it's important to close with Martin Winkler. Martin is a professor of classics and a Latinist at George Mason University in DC. But more importantly for today, he has been a pioneer in working in the space between classics and the study of cinema. His complete monograph on Ovid and cinema is of course well known, and we are grateful that he is offering an update, apparently, Epilegomena to Ovid and the movies. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sandro, for your introduction. Well, I'm very happy to have been invited to talk about my two great loves, which are antiquity and the cinema. Somebody famous once said, nobody can serve two masters, but he never said anything about two mistresses. So antiquity and the cinema are my two mistresses whom I've tried to serve faithfully. I would like to mention two things before I start on my subject, two preliminaries, as it were. One is that I would like to dedicate this presentation to the memory of two dear friends and academic mentors and advisors. One from NYU, the late David Constant, and the other one of the major Ovidian scholars in his own right, Frederick Arl from Cornell, who passed away earlier this year. Thank you. His book on the Metamorphoses, wordplay, soundplay, and such is, I think, a milestone in classical and particularly Ovidian scholarship. At the same time, I also have brought something Ovidian that I am convinced only one person at the moment in this room knows of. And I brought this as a kind of a reward for your patience, and perhaps also as a bit of a surprise. And I have this right here, and I will show it to you on screen and in a tangible form too. Okay, the title of my presentation, as Sandro indicated, is meant that I would like to revisit here, briefly at least, something that I dealt with in much greater detail in this book, Ovid on Screen, a montage of attractions, which came out in 2020 and has just been reissued in paperback, so it's even affordable. Let me add in parentheses, if you're interested in this, send me an email and I can send you a flyer with a discount. I'm not trying to hawk this because the royalties I would get from this are minimal to begin with. All right. The book's cover, by the way, is part of one of the posters that Jean Cocteau designed for his 1960 film, The Testament of Orpheus, Le Testament d'Orphée. In the book, I had to make do with static images, screenshots and so on, from films. So today I will show you what a few of the scenes I examined actually look like. I will, of course, adduce some other material as well. In a manner of speaking, this presentation is a kind of afterword to the book, hence my term Epilegomena. My coinage, Cinemetamorphosis, That's also in my title, Epilegomena in Cinemetamorphosin Ovidianam. The coinage Metamorphoses, Cinemetamorphosis, was to have been the book's original title, but the press nixed it for commercial reasons. I would have preferred that to something like Cinemetamorphoses, a montage of Ovidian attractions, to the more straightforward Ovid on screen. As one might say, and I misquote intentionally, habent sua fata libelorum et tituli. But let me get started on the topic. In Metamorphoses 8, Ovid immortalized Daedalus and Icarus, the first human aviators in the Western imagination, as exemplars of ingenuity and daring. They also became the mythical ancestors of modern technological innovators. So it is not surprising that the myth about the first human flight should have been associated with a new technology of storytelling in moving images. In a 1946 essay called, in English, The Myth of Total Cinema, a French film scholar André Bazin, also the spiritual father of the French New Wave, referred to Icarus and Plato to characterize the cinema. Here's a text passage. Let me ask you to read through the text passages. I will have several of these, some short, some longer. Please read through these on your own, rather than me reading at the same time, because we would run out of time otherwise. It is unlikely that Bazin was specifically thinking about Ovid, but the Icarus myth did become most famous because of Ovid. And it is telling that Bazin should refer to antiquity as a matter of course when he pointed to the essence of cinema. Somebody else had already done so 4 years earlier, and this is somebody whom Jennifer just mentioned, Sergei Eisenstein. He wrote in 1942. This is one of my favorite quotations from Eisenstein. Notice the combinations of Dickens, Shakespeare, the Greeks, and later on this heritage. This comes from an article of his, Dickens, Griffith, and Ourselves. Eisenstein, too, considered the cinema as an idealistic phenomenon, hence his coinage in Russian, Cinematographichnost, for the movements inherent in traditional static images and implied in narrative literature. This is usually given in English as a cinematism by French, le cinématisme, but more literally translated, it would be something like kinematographicity, which is a little bit of a monstrous term, so cinematism, I think, works just as well. To Eisenstein, Cinematographichnost is everywhere. His rationale for this is here. Note particularly the ending of this quotation, to merge two motionless phases into an image of movement. The cinema, accordingly, helps us synthesize, and that is his own term, synthesize the arts. The quotation you see here comes from a long and particularly fascinating text by Eisenstein on Lessing's Laocoon. Even before he turned to cinema, Eisenstein, at age 22, had drawn caricatures of Socrates and Strepsiades from Aristophanes' Clouds. I've chosen his Socrates, and it's a very effective caricature in bringing out the extreme ugliness of Socrates' appearance. I've chosen this Socrates for the cover image of my forthcoming book on Eisenstein. Eisenstein was also greatly taken with Disney animation, which he considered a prime example of what he called plasmaticness, a major feature of all animation. He even wrote a monograph called, in English, On Disney. Imagine what you might have thought of the Pixar animation, The Incredibles, where the changes in bodies, perhaps even exceeding those that Jennifer showed us earlier, go to all kinds of extremes. I confess that the girl on the viewer's left, Elastigirl, is my favorite in this family. Classical Greece and Rome have always been among the most versatile sources of inspiration for filmmakers. A remarkable example is, you guessed it, Ovid. Many of the myths to which he gave definitive shape have been adapted to the screen, most frequently in modernized versions. The Orpheus and Eurydice myth, for example, is among Ovid's most enduring tales. Milestones in film history are Jean Cocteau's Orphée, 1950, Marcel Camus' Orfeo Negro, 1959. There even was something completely different, Schroeder Orpheus of 1990. This description tells you what it was about. It is not one of my favorites. Literary translations and adaptations are obvious forms of verbal metamorphosis. The term metamorphosis can usually be applied to adaptations from page to screen as well. Film versions of texts necessarily impose extensive changes on their sources. Since they follow their own rules, we might call them, you guessed this too, Cinemetamorphoses, as I proposed. Ovid is the poet of metamorphoses par excellence. So I now turn to the Ovidian nature of cinema by discussing a few cinemetamorphoses of Ovidian themes, which I have analyzed in more detail in Ovid on Screen. There, I could not demonstrate the sequence of moving images. So, of course, I had to only choose screenshots, still images. So I'd like to show you today a few examples of how these metamorphoses actually look like on screen. And I've been very, very selective in this, and I've only selected a few. I should also forewarn you that one of these is not from the Metamorphoses or based on the Metamorphoses, but a different work of Ovid's. So I should perhaps have expanded my title by not talking only about Epilegomena, but also about Epilegomena, things to be shown afterwards. I begin with, as Alessandro already prepared you. Oops, sorry, that's the Schroeder Orpheus background, all right. I begin with Italian poet, playwright, and novelist Gabriele D'Annunzio, Italy's foremost man of letters in the late 19th and early 20th century. Here he is in a sort of star pose. You can barely make out perhaps the inscription at his feet, Non nisi grandia canto. He was commonly called Il Vate, in other words, the Vates, as if he were Ovid, Horace, Virgil, all wrote into one. D'Annunzio became fascinated with cinema because of Ovid. An essay of his had the title, I'll quote with apologies to the native speakers of Italian, del cinematografo considerato come strumento di liberazione e come arte di trasfigurazione, on the film camera considered as instrument of liberation and art of transformation. In it, D'Annunzio explained his interest in the cinema. And this is something that Alessandro just summarized. So notice, again, I spent some hours in the film studio. He says, I wanted to experiment with the story of Daphne. What we heard about Daphne yesterday does not surprise. It does not surprise us that D'Annunzio was right in sync with all this at the same time. I must admit that when he says, I spent some hours in the film studio, there has never been any evidence found for this, that D'Annunzio actually made a film or parts of a film or moments even of a film. And the books on early history of cinema that I've consulted are silent about this too. So it may just be that this is an example of the grandia, the grandiosity, the big things that he talks about in connection with himself. The painting D'Annunzio referred to, we already saw yesterday too, the Volon Daphne myth from the Italian history of art. What counts most here, however, is D'Annunzio's tribute to Ovid as a Vates of cinema. He said, I quote again, I never stopped thinking of Daphne's delicate arm changed into a leafy branch. The true and unique virtue of the film camera is metamorphosis, trasfigurazione, and I tell you that Ovid is its poet. Sooner or later, the poetry of the Metamorphoses would enchant the masses. The earliest master of screen metamorphosis and enchantment was in France Georges Méliès, the first wizard of cinema, as he is affectionately called today by his aficionados. He worked principally with multiple exposures and superimpositions. Méliès repeatedly told stories that are set in or otherwise take up themes and figures from antiquity. Méliès once explained how he discovered the camera's power of transformation. This is fascinating. You can barely imagine how happy I was when I came across this. This film that he made, where he discovered the power of transformation by an accident when the camera jammed, that footage is lost. We don't have any of this. So here is the very origin of cinemetamorphosis in a literal sense. As early as 1898, Méliès had made the first ever Pygmalion and Galatea film, called Pygmalion et Galatée. In 1903, he made La Statue Animée, the animated statue, which survives almost complete. Statues come to life in a great number of Méliès's films. So we may agree with an art historian who has observed that with Méliès there came, I quote, the passage of inanimate to animated and from marble to celluloid. In the 20th century, Ovid's tale of Pygmalion became famous thanks to George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, 1912, its classic film adaptation of 1938 in Britain, and of course, the worldwide phenomenon of Leonard Lowell's My Fair Lady, 1956, filmed in 1964. The cinema can easily animate the inanimate. A case in point is the Hellenistic Discobolus by the sculptor Myron, which survives only in Roman copies and modern copies of these Roman copies. The statue comes to human life as part of the prologue of Leni Riefenstahl's 1938 two-part epic Olympia. And I hope that this works. I would like to show you a brief clip from the prologue of the first part. My favorite screen example, however, from inanimate to animate appeared in 1927 in Metropolis, the silent science fiction epic directed by Fritz Lang, one of my favorites. An eerie inventor called Rotwang, which is very ironical. Yeah, his name means red cheek, but he lives in a subterranean cave where he invents robots and whatnot. Rotwang has fashioned a female robot whose facial features resemble that of the woman whom he had loved but lost to his rival Johann Fredersen, the master and owner of Metropolis. The early release versions of Metropolis with English intertitles changed his name to, you may have guessed this too, Masterman. Rotwang here, in the clip that I'm showing you, is showing Fredersen, the robot, for the first time. Note 2, the atmospheric music composed by Gottfried Huppertz. And my apologies for the light effect. This would have been, these clips would work better in greater darkness, but here we go. The inventor is on the right. Well, let me stop here. You may have noticed the irony that eventually nobody, Wolfgang says, will be able to tell a machine man from a real person. Almost 100 years later, we are virtually there, are we not? It may be instructive to juxtapose the elaborate and, for its time, technically cutting-edge metamorphosis in Metropolis with a radically different one from the cinema's early modern era. In Ingmar Bergman's Persona of 1966, the personalities of two women become one. These are a stage actress who has suffered a nervous breakdown and is now staying at a quiet retreat, and the nurse who looks after her. They're played by Liv Ullmann and Bibi Andersson. What I will show you is how Ingmar Bergman and Sven Nykvist, his cinematographer, Bergman on your left, Bergman on your right, looking through the viewfinder, and Nykvist on the left, how they show us the decisive moment, the merging quite literally of the two women's personalities.
Den lilla pojken greps av en häftig och ofattbar kärlek till sin mor. Du värjer dig förtvivlat. Du känner att du inte kan återgälda.
Don't worry about the dialogue.
Så försöker du och försöker. Men det blir bara grymma och tafatta möten mellan dig och pojken. Du kan inte. Du är kall och likgiltig. Och han ser på dig. Han älskar dig och han är så mjuk. Du vill slå honom för han inte lämnar dig i fred. Du tycker han är äcklig med sin tjocka mun och sin fula kropp. Sina fuktiga och vädjande ögon. Du tycker han är äcklig och du är rädd. Nej! Jag är inte som du. Jag känner inte som du. Jag är syster Alma, jag är bara här för att hjälpa dig. Jag är inte Elisabeth Fågler. Du är Elisabeth Fågler. Jag vill gärna ha... Jag älskar... Jag har inte...
In Ovid, Metamorphoses brings a character's mental or emotional state to the surface and makes it visible. So do both these films. In Metropolis, an evil essence will be hidden under and disguised as a virtuous outside person. This is the evil Maria who was patterned on the good Maria, the heroine of the film. Let me leave all that out. In Persona, the nurse, already susceptible to the actress's, well, persona, identifies herself with her so closely that their personalities, represented by the faces, actually fuse. Classical scholar Joseph Solado wrote in his book on Ovid, I quote, "Metamorphosis regularly makes essence visible, plain, clear. More specifically, note what he says, it's a change which preserves, an alteration which maintains identity." One particular film may serve as an apt illustration. And this is Darren Aronofsky's Black Swan from 2010. Black Swan achieves its emotional power by means of computer-generated special effects, CGI. In Metamorphoses 2, 7, and 12, Ovid told 3 stories in which a young man called Cygnus, or Kyknos, is changed into the bird whose name he bears. We already touched on this earlier. Black Swan tells a modern story about a production of Swan Lake here in New York. As you will have noticed, most of what I say has nothing to do directly with New York, so Ovid in New York. Well, here is an exception. I have another one coming up. What happens in Black Swan? A rather high-strung young ballerina gets the chance to play Odile, the Black Swan in the ballet. The physical strain that the role demands from her, we just heard about this from Jennifer, and the emotional toll that it takes on her psyche lead to a series of hallucinations. She discovers disturbing changes in herself, such as smaller black feathers protruding from under her skin. Is she now, under all that psychological strain, actually turning into the Black Swan? So it appears, because everything we see on screen is presented as if it were real. That is to say, there are no indications that what we watch, the dancer discovering about herself, is not objective or factual. although these are subjective images revealing her inner state and show what is impossible. With the Black Swan, we do not always know where the reality ends and imagination begins, even though we remain fully aware that the combination of human and animal bodies is physiologically impossible. The dancer's gradual metamorphosis remains incomplete, but what we see on screen is the kind of physical embodiment of an emotional state of which we read again and again in Ovid. The climax of the dancer's process of transformation comes on opening night. Summoning her last resources, she whirls onto the stage, and we follow her metamorphosis from a human moving like a swan into a part human and part animal creature. Her intermediate stage fully conforms to Ovidian metamorphosis. As has been well said, Ovid is particularly drawn to describing in-between states, usually during the process of transformation. So let me now show you the climactic scene from Black Swan. It's quite something. I am not always a great fan of CGI, but here it is exactly right. The long shot of the dancer taking her bow, you just saw it, is from the audience's point of view. It combines, I hope it's halfway here, visibly here, it combines her human shape in the foreground with the part human and part swan shadows on the wall, and in this way tells us that the metamorphosis we just witnessed has not been real. How can she look like what she looks like in the foreground and still have wings? We now realize that all the earlier swan-like features on her body had been the outward manifestation of her inner state, which Aronofsky had made visible to us. The animal features we have seen realistically had not been real at all. The two states of reality and psychology have fused into realistic images of unreality. The long shot cleverly, this one, preserves the fusion of both states. The moment signals to us how intense her emotional state must have been. The content of her mind is still swan-like, rendered as the animal shadows cast by her human body. I now return to the Daedalus myth. His labyrinth, as described in Metamorphoses 8, has served modern and postmodern literary scholars and theorists as an analogy to intricate literary narratives and as a symbol of the autonomy of a text over its author, or the supposed autonomy sometimes. Daedalus builds a complicated structure of, it says, a multiplex domus. His design is fiendishly clever, for he leads one's gaze, I quote, he leads one's gaze astray with twisted curves of different mysteriously winding passages. Lumina flexu ducit in errorem variar ambage viarum. The simile of the meander, the river that flows backwards and forwards, as if it were leading itself astray, vividly expresses the intricacy of Daedalus' creation. With its changeable and uncertain flow, ambiguo lapsu, the meander proceeds just as anyone inside the labyrinth would stumble along, directionless, coming back to the same spot again and again, utterly helpless. If I may be allowed a brief autobiographical confession, that basically is what I experienced when I was for the first time downstairs in the labyrinth at Knossos, all on my own. I couldn't find my way out for quite a while. Well. A complex narrative line, as it is called these days, symbolized by Ariadne's thread that Theseus unspools inside the labyrinth, often falls back on itself. Think of Tristram Shandy, as the post-classical granddaddy of them all. Ovid's language illustrates and exemplifies the labyrinth's complex nature with its own complex syntax and word order. A milestone of modernist cinema is Last Year at Marienbad, 1961, written by Alain Robbe-Grillet and directed by another Alain Resnais. This film is an enigmatic tale about mysterious characters set in a secluded chateau-like hotel of Baroque splendor. This one, and I'm not showing you anything new, I dare say, is its most iconic image, the park. Note the shadows, or the absent shadows at the same time. Resnais's chateau is a multiplex domus 2, whose rooms and corridors appear to be endless and may lead nowhere. A roving camera explores them extensively and intensely, but viewers rarely know where exactly anyone is. At the beginning, a man's voice on the soundtrack describes to an as yet unseen listener the surroundings and the eerie effect that these have. He does so rather obsessively, returning to the same phrases again and again. I would like to show you a part of this opening scene in Last Year at Marienbad, and I have a translation of the main parts of the text under the images. Again, I would like to read this, and this goes on for actually quite longer than what I'm showing you here.
Qu'aucun bruit d'épain ne parvient à sa propre oreille, comme si l'oreille elle-même de celui qui s'avance, une fois de plus, le long de ce couloir, à travers ces salons, ces galeries, dans cette construction de notre siècle, cet hôtel immense, luxueux, baroque, des couloirs interminables sous ces couloirs, silencieux, déserts, surchargés d'un décor sombre et froid de boiseries, de stucs, de panneaux moulurés, marbre, glace noire, tableaux aux teintes noires, colonnes, encadrements sculptés de portes, enfilades de portes, de galeries, de couloirs transversaux qui débouchent à leur tour sur des salons déserts, des salons surchargés d'une ornementation d'un autre siècle, des salles silencieuses où les pas de celui qui s'avance sont absorbés par des tapis si lourds, si épais, qu'aucun bruit de pas ne parvient à sa propre oreille, comme si l'oreille elle-même était très loin, loin du sol, du tapis, très loin de ce décor mouillé, très loin de cette frise compliquée qui court sous le vif, qui se rend dans ses comme si le sol était encore des arbres de gravier, des dalles de pierre, sur lesquelles je m'avançais, une fois de plus, le long de ces couloirs, à travers ces salons, ces galeries, dans cette construction, dans notre siècle, cet hôtel immense, luxueux, baroque. Lugubre où de couloirs interminables succèdent aux couloirs, silencieux, désert, surchargé d'un décor sombre et froid de boiseries, de stucs, de panneaux moulurés, marbre, glace noire, tableaux aux teintes noires, colonnes, encadrements sculptés de portes, enfilades de portes, de galeries, des couloirs transversaux qui débouchent à leur tour sur des salons déserts, des salons surchargés d'une ornementation d'un autre siècle, des salles silencieuses où les pas de celui qui s'avance sont absorbés par des tapis si lourds, si épais, qu'aucun bruit de pas ne parvient
Well, we seem to have become a victim of the proverbial diabolus in machina, who must be lurking around here somewhere. Like Ovid's meander and the corridors in Daedalus' labyrinth, the man's words and the film's narrative circle back on themselves as if there were no escape from time or place. So do the images. They repeatedly show us where we have already been. If the corridors and galleries, you just saw some of them, with side corridors branching off, remind us of Ovid's description of Daedalus' labyrinth, so the virtuoso eloquence of René's visuals may be comparable to the verbal virtuosity in Ovid. If you can agree with me on this, then you may also consider the formal elegance of the film's cinematography and René's clever editing as filmic equivalents of Ovid's stylistic and syntactic elegance. But what about Ariadne's thread? For this aspect of the labyrinth myth, I turn to Mario Bava, Italian cinematographer and director, and his thriller, The Girl Who Knew Too Much, from 1963. It is often considered to be the sort of, first example of the giallo, the Italian genre of suspense thrillers and so on. Bava pays homage, and not only with his title, to Alfred Hitchcock, the master of suspense. In Bava's film, a young American woman who is an avid reader of detective novels travels to Rome and gets involved in a bizarre series of murders. She soon begins to suspect that the killer, who has long eluded the police, is now after her. She is staying by herself in an old palazzo, close to the Spanish Steps, which has its own sinister history. Scared at night, she begins to think of ways to protect herself, and she hits on just the right idea to take inspiration from her beloved thrillers. Bava's film, in its most iconic sequence, which I will show you, shows us a tangible analogy to the kind of narrative thread that characterizes all mystery plots on page and screen. The girl has recently finished a mystery novel called, you never believe it, Ariadne's Terrible Thread. Inspired by it, our plucky heroine first pours a generous amount of talcum powder on the stone floor inside the apartment entrance to make it slippery. Then she ties a tenacious tangle of string, as the film's narrator calls it, to various pieces of furniture, potted plants, doorknobs, and piles of household objects throughout the apartment. The narrator informs us, I quote in English, "Killers never read thrillers," fortunately. Actually, this works better in English than it does in the original Italian. He also tells us that Ariadne's Terrible Thread, the book, has just been published in the US and so cannot yet have reached Italy. It is, of course, a fictitious novel. I did my darndest to find a copy of it, but no, it doesn't exist. Bava, who shot his own film in almost gothic black and white, here rises to the occasion in this very, very clever scene.
Si scivola sulla bianca insidia del borotalco, specie se le gambe sono intrappolate da un tenace labirinto di spago. Sì, forse è un po' ingenuo, ma chissà, proprio per questo meno prevedibile. Gli assassini non leggono mai i libri gialli, per fortuna. E poi l'orribile filo di Arianna, il romanzo che la stava ispirando, era appena uscito a Filadelfia. In Italia non potevano averlo ancora tradotto.
she is hearing footsteps.
Chi è che urla? Chi è lei? Ma cos'è, una trappola? Ma cosa dice? Che trappola? Mi lasci passare! Mi lasci passare! Nora! Nora!
It's suspenseful, but also very funny. And it has a nice romance, because the helpful policeman is attacked by her boyfriend. If last year at Marienbad was too cerebral and the goal you knew too much too scary for you, here is another and more mythical screen labyrinth from 2012. In Wrath of the Titans, the sequel to the remake of the classic Clash of the Titans from 1980, which has gorgeous stop-motion special effects by Ray Harryhausen. Now CGI rules, as we already know, and this new labyrinth shows quite effectively how it does. The film is not all that remarkable, even though Rosamund Pike is in it, but the labyrinth sequence is actually quite attractive, and the most attractive feature in the entire film. I've selected two parts from a long sequence to give you an idea. The labyrinth, of course, is going to be, it's a subterranean labyrinth, and it's going to be very, very dark. So it may not be, you may not be able to see much. If you like, we can skip this and go to the next subject. Is there any preference? No? Well.
This way.
Well, at least you get a bit of an idea. All right. Let me now turn to an Ovidian moment in one of the films by the master of suspense himself. Although our subject is the Metamorphoses, I already mentioned that I hope you will indulge me in showing you one of my favorite Ovidian moments in all of cinema, even if Ovid was far from everybody's mind. The speaker of Amoris 1.5 describes an erotic encounter with his lover Corinna, when his lover Corinna unexpectedly visited him as he was lying drowsy on his bed during the noonday heat. The appearance of Corinna has a close parallel in Hitchcock's Rear Window, 1954, despite obvious differences between the time and the setting of Amoris 1.5 and Hitchcock's film. For an instant, both works evoke a comparable atmosphere of charged eroticism. That it is also a murder mystery, as this German poster shows you, I leave out of consideration today. In Rear Window, a photojournalist, his leg in a cast, is confined to a small apartment in a tenement building in Greenwich Village, presumably in our neighborhood. So we have another Ovid in New York example, although not in regard to the Metamorphoses. And everything was filmed far away at the Paramount Studios in LA, so there is no real New York anywhere on screen. In the New York of Rear Window, there is a heat wave. In Ovid, aestus erat. The photographer is half asleep in his wheelchair in the late afternoon, shortly before dusk. The setting in Ovid, with one side of the window open, the other closed, is comparable to that in Rear Window. The one in Ovid makes for a chiaroscuro effect of subdued light, like that in a forest, which is of course not applicable to Rear Window, or like the light at dawn or dusk, which is. Ovid's expression, sub lucent crepuscula, dim twilight shines faintly, is a near-perfect description of the light just before dusk in Rear Window. The unexpected shadow that then falls across the drowsing photographer's face, unexpected as I said, is a visual equivalent of Ovid's ecce, look, at the beginning of line 9 when Corinna appears. The visual force of his ecce is revealed on screen with a cut from the man's face, partly obscured by the shadow of the head of someone as yet identified, to a frontal view of the visitor's face. So let me show you this clip and then comment on it a little bit more.
How's your leg?
Hurts a little.
And your stomach?
Empty as a football.
And do you love life?
Not too active.
Anything else bothering you?
Mm-hmm. Who are you?
Reading from top to bottom. Lisa. Carol. Fremont.
Corinna's entrance, like Lisa's here, resembles a theophany. Hitchcock stylizes Lisa's kiss in a manner that elevates her entrance to that of a superhuman being descending from above. Hitchcock presents Lisa by means of staggered editing. In the sideways shot with both profiles, it sort of looks a little jerky. Staggered editing, which has an effect of it's an effect that is usually achieved when certain frames within a shot are later printed twice, so that a naturally fluid motion looks slightly jerky, although it remains graceful. But it no longer seems completely natural. We are jolted just for a moment out of the familiar ways in which we experience our surroundings. Hitchcock did 27 takes of the kissing scene in order to get it exactly right. Notoriously, pun intended, Hitchcock fell in love with his beautiful leading ladies, especially blondes. This circumstance may help explain the exquisite stylization of what Hitchcock himself called Grace Kelly's, I quote, sexual elegance, end quote, in Rear Window. Her first name fits the character she plays. With her heavenly grace, Lisa appears like a mirage. Now for my peroration. Why, you may ask, is the cinema the ideal and irresistible medium to tell all manner of stories? The answer to such a question can be heard at the beginning of Jean-Luc Godard's 1963 film Le Mépris, Contempt, in a quotation wrongly attributed to André Bazin, whom I quoted at the beginning. Here is part of the prologue that tells us this. And again, you can't hear it, so let me just translate. The cinema presents to our gaze an alternate world that conforms to our desires. That's what's said. I'm almost done.
Sorry, Martin, we need to close.
Okay. Well, let me fast forward. That's the same thing in Greek, which is sort of my personal motto. And there's an additional part, Ovid on the Art of Love, a film that came out after the book was done, with a precursor of it in the gutter, which I've also skipped. I was going to mention the Bluebird of a silent film, which I discovered after the book was done. Its intertitle shows you nicely what the essence of Ovidian Metamorphoses, even in this early silent film. And there is a statue of Ovid, and I've taken the liberty of adding 2 words to his line 2, in corpora imaginibus moventia. I will also skip Rita Hayworth as top secretary to tell you that we've reached the end. But there is still a reward. Do we have time for this? Or should I skip this too? I can. It's this book, which came out in 2023, Letters to Ovid. It's a collection of academics writing to Ovid as if such a thing were possible. Since I have it here, feel free to look at it maybe here at the desk or wherever, but please do not make off with it. And having said all this, let me thank you for your patience and attention. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin.
Of course.
So I need to wrap up this session. I'm sorry there is no time for the roundtable, but I hope that this conversation will continue. We hope to hear from you. And I just wanted to mention that the recording of this will be available on the website of the Center for Ancient Studies. Not now, but in the near future, says Anna. So thank you very much for your interest. And thank you again on behalf of the Center for Ancient Studies and the director, Matthew Santirocco, who sadly cannot be here. Thank you very much.